Next, we'll have Matt Germino. Matt specializes in biophysical and physiological ecology of plant communities with an emphasis on forest and shrub steppe habitats. He received his PhD from the botany department at University of Wyoming and is currently an associate professor at Idaho State University. And his teaching and research program spans a wide range of disciplines in plant biology and ecology at scales ranging from the cell to the ecosystem.
So one of the greatest environmental changes in the West over recent decades to the last century has been changes in the herb component of our landscapes, especially in upland habitats that aren't densely forested. And one of the principal changes that we've seen is an increase in exotic species. And here you can see in my title an analogy, drawing from the medical practice here, diagnoses, prognoses, and prescriptions. And this is useful for us to some degree. Consider that a medical doctor is concerned with treating sick patients, specific individuals. Land managers are concerned with treating specific units of ground, like acres or whatever. And I think by comparing and contrasting how we treat lands with how the medical practice succeeds in treating sick individuals, I think we can glean some important insight, some of which may be obvious to this audience. Firstly, the medical doctor has some real advantages for doing things like treating the flu. They have a rich body of scientific information which helps them understand the physiological dysfunction in the individual, and therefore they're able to know how specific symptoms link together to form a syndrome which tightly matches a given mechanistic dysfunction in the individual. The net result is they can make concise prescriptions or treatments that treat not just the symptoms but the actual causes of the problem. In contrast, land managers have, in my opinion, a woefully inadequate scientific understanding. There's a woefully inadequate amount of scientific information to support land management. A common theme in everything we do for land management is uncertainty, and that uncertainty is much greater than for the medical practitioner. Consider also, though, that land managers, how often do we actually make a good diagnosis or consider the prognosis with and without treatment? And how often is our treatment something like dropping herbicides out of plains over massive land areas of the Snake River Plain? I can assure you that only treats the symptom and not the cause of our problems with herbs. So my outline here is going to roughly follow this paradigm of diagnosis to treatment, although in a very loose sense. First, I'm going to give you some examples of problems in herb communities. My emphasis is on sagebrush steppe, but let's go lower and warmer in elevation, and at the other extreme, let's go higher and colder to see what bounds the sagebrush. We need to be, in these talks, we're supposed to be thinking about the future, forward thinking, while climate change is really significant. When you're thinking about herbaceous communities, they may be quick to respond to climate changes. I think we've already seen that in the last few decades, actually. Then I'm going to give two examples of how native plants affect the vulnerability or resistance of communities to invasions, and what can we do in our restoration to bolster the immunity of our lands to exotics. And then finally, there's a lot of confusion, I think, in how we value native and exotic species, and I'm going to describe to you a new opportunity that's recently been funded, which I think is part of the path forward in integrating our efforts. This is a very familiar scene to you. This is photos from near Twin Falls, Idaho, depicting the fire cheatgrass cycle. I think most of you know about this. Following fires, the post-fire environment gives a selective advantage for the growth of cheatgrass, which in turn forms combustible fuels, and greatly accelerates fire frequencies. Moreover, research at places like Utah State University tells us that cheatgrass modifies soils and does other things to exclude perennials in favor of itself. These sorts of feedbacks are, number one, hallmarks of the desertification process. That's the bigger picture. But more practically, they cause these infestations to be extraordinarily resistant to restoration practices. And so this is what our deserts are becoming to look like. This is the Minnetonka Fire, north of Twin Falls is down here. The highway going from Pocatello to Boise would be down here. This is an area where we wanted to work. And 100 years ago, I'm certain that a map of the fire history would not look like this. But recurrent fires are now the mode under which these landscapes operate. The matrix for the spread and persistence of invasives the landscape matrix has changed profoundly. Mostly we're concerned with cheatgrass here and now, but we really ought to be thinking about cheatgrass in the near future. We've just undergone about 10 years of very unusual temperatures and drought, and it's quite likely that the future holds more unpredictability and in climate and also change. Bethany Bradley is one of the few individuals out there trying to get a grip on how species like Bromus tectorum cheatgrass might change in the future. Here's a map based on satellite imagery and climate records of where cheatgrass exists now. I think most of us could recognize that her efforts need our support for improvement. And the red shows the suitable climate. Of course, what is the future climate? Well, we really don't know. Her strategy is to take the 12 general circulation models, which were the basis of the 2007 IPCC report on climate, and look at how cheatgrass might shift according to groupings of these climate prediction models. And what you see is something like this: cheatgrass moving to the north. I think a more important question for immediate concerns, rather than the future spread upward, is what might fill the floristic vacuum left in our vast areas of cheatgrass. And 2 points I want to make here. Number one, I've been needing to do some research. We were doing some turbulent flux measurements over cheatgrass. We wanted to find some cheatgrass monocultures, and I was surprised at how hard they are to find them. Cheatgrass, and I would assert to you, one of the take-home messages of this talk is that grasslands for most of the Intermountain West, especially the sagebrush steppe, are not a very stable plant community type. Most of the cheatgrass that I've ever observed has already been invaded by Jim Hill mustard. Here you can see Russian thistles. Knapweeds are coming in also. So, number one, these communities are pretty unstable. Interestingly, there's one of the best studies on the stability of these invasive communities comes from Utah State University. There's somebody by the name of Andrew Komatiski who did some multivariate statistics on these communities, and showed that indeed we have exotic communities. What we don't have is a book that describes the exotic communities of the Intermountain West. And in my opinion, that's a problem. And I hope that looking forward in the next 10 years, somebody will write that book for us. Here's a cheatgrass, Jim Hill mustard, Russian thistle community. If the cheatgrass is excluded from this area by a warmer climate in the future, perhaps a drier one, what would fill in its wake? More of the secondary invaders that have deeper roots, that can have deeper roots like the sagebrush, or might it be some of the species like the Bromus rubens from the Mojave Desert? My department and I have been looking at shrublands in the Mojave. Here's a site that we observed getting invaded from the period about 1998 onward. It burned. In the year afterwards, this cheatgrass, or this red brome took off, The site was pretty much a monoculture of red brome. The native diversity was reduced markedly after the fire. Grazing in the year after fire was followed by a sharp reduction in the red brome and a dramatic increase in storkbill, erodium. So here you can see a parallel in the community tendencies of brome. And here what we're also seeing is a species that might be a good candidate to move northward and replace our current cheatgrass infestations. In our forward thinking, we need to be thinking about these matrices. What we have now in the landscape will affect what we have for weeds in the future. Let's go to higher elevations. I used to think that high elevations were fairly immune to exotic plant problems. And botanists like Rose Lehman of the Forest Service, this is Rob Mickelson, her supervisor for the forest, they've shown me that these high elevations, this is from Franklin Basin, which by the way is just to the north of here. This is pretty much a monoculture of tarweed, a native invader. Steve Monson, these are some of his plots, his efforts to restore this, largely unsuccessful. Like the many studies that have been done here since about the turn of the century. This site is incredibly resistant to invasions, or to restoration. Part of it may result from tarweed's alteration of soil, physical and biochemical chemical properties that perpetuate tarweed and exclude the natives. One of their big concerns is not so much the lack of diversity and the lack of the tall forbs that should normally exist here, like lupins, but more the exposure to the bare soil, because this bare soil exposure puts them into a category of decision making where they've got to prioritize soil stabilization. Incidentally, these sites have been prone to significant erosion. Another pet peeve or interest of mine is related to smooth brome. Here's a species that we still plant. It was planted years ago. It's still planted. If you go to one of the major seed companies and look for a native mountain mix, guess what? Smooth brome will probably be in it. This is near some land that I own in Teutonia, Idaho. It's high elevation, 6,000 to 7,000 feet. I can find the remnants of mountain sagebrush and snowberry in here. I think it might have been burned at one point. Smooth brome came off of the neighboring CRP land, and within the last 10 years, it's become thickly infested with thistle. This is a very common and recurrent syndrome of invasion. So a lot of our decisions we actively manage the floristics of large plant communities with aerial seeding, drill seeding. Most of us are aware of this. BLM rehab, fire rehab specialists have a very narrow window of time. They're very constrained by our institutional framework in how they decide on post-fire restoration activities. That constrains their ability to find the ideal seed sources and things like that for restoration. But photos like this, which probably haven't been seen very frequently since the Dust Bowl, but in the last decade are very common. This is a huge dust storm in southeast Idaho. These sorts of activities seem to warrant the aggressive restoration practices that we're using. A student of mine has been measuring the actual rates of wind erosion on fires. This is a site at the Idaho National Lab. Using dust collectors, he showed repeatedly now for about 3 different fires that wind erosion is quite readily observed in the few months following fires. But even on sites that don't have a strong vegetation recovery, the soils are pretty well stabilized following the first spring. So that makes me wonder how much reseeding efforts could actually help stabilize the soils here. And in fact, I also wonder a little bit about potential collateral damage that might result. And I have never been to the Milford Flats fire, but I have seen photos of the dust coming through Salt Lake City. And some other people apparently are finding that some of the restoration activities have maybe had not the desired benefit to soil stabilization there. In our system, here you can see a very small amount of soil cover was corresponded with stabilization here. The whole issue of bare soil is really important. Bare soil has a bad rap. And the NRCS, the Soil Conservation Service, they tell us, the first thing you need to worry about is covering up that bare soil. But I would argue to you that, and I hope that somebody will write a paper someday that counterbalances these perspectives and tells us that bare soil may be a natural feature of perennial bunchgrass and sagebrush communities. There's roots underneath here. And just how unstable are these things, and how do crusts play into the role of bare soil? I've listened to land managers justify their use of short-term, high-intensity grazing over large areas as being useful in reducing the amount of bare soil exposure. And undoubtedly that will come with an increase in cheatgrass. Perhaps the bare soil might be more valuable to us. By the way, Amber Hoover is here. She's got a very interesting data set on this matrix. She can link all of this to things like the aerodynamic properties of landscapes. One of the species we plant most often has been and continues to be the venerable crested wheatgrass. So Mark, you have Douglas fir coming from the University of Oregon. Well, the schools out here, crested wheatgrass is us. However, others, people like Roger Blue at the Idaho National Lab, have been carefully mapping the changes, or the so-called stability of crested wheatgrass. How well does it hold its forested composition, and does it spread? That's a major question. Here you can see that over about a 40-year period, it's more than doubling in size. There again, you see the same thing. This may or may not be desirable depending on your values for crested wheatgrass. Now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the stability of grass-dominated communities in this system. Here's a photo of a burn site. This is the edge of the burn. This is unburned sagebrush near the Idaho-Montana border, mountain big sagebrush with some Wyoming sagebrush and 3-tip down in here. This is leafy spurge. Infestations like this have persisted for many years in burn areas despite regular applications of herbicides. Big question is, what is the ecological force sustaining this undesired alteration to our herbaceous plant community? So I'm going to talk a little bit about sagebrush, and I'm going to talk about sagebrush as it relates to a numerous class of exotic species, exotic forbs from Europe and Eurasia. If you look in Weeds of the West, which is a book that called Sagebrush a Weed, if you flip through the pages, you'll see that most of the weeds are not grasses like cheatgrass, but most of the species are actually forbs. They tend to have deep tap roots. And we've done several ecophysiological studies to show that these species have very unusual characteristics relative to native forbs. In fact, their water use patterns, I would argue, look a lot more like sagebrush than they do to native forbs. And this is relevant. Here, by the way, is a roadside community of cheatgrass and some needle and thread with spotted knapweed growing happily in it. Okay, so spotted knapweed would be one of these secondary invaders following the initial invasion by annual grasses. So we're interested in knowing if in disturbed areas, like burned areas or areas that have been plowed, or maybe tiberathon has been, or herbicides have been used to get rid of sagebrush, if the loss of sagebrush in some way gives a unique advantage to the exotic forbs, and whether or not the advantage is linked to deep soil water. Here's a schematic showing the idea. In the undisturbed condition, the community readily uses all the soil water beneath it. There's many studies from Utah State and elsewhere that show this point. There's also many studies that show when you lose your slow-growing perennials that have to reseed after fire, those are the perennials that normally are deep-rooted. When you lose them, there tends to be less depletion of the deep soil water. And the hypothesis is that that bodes well for any species, like an exotic forb from Europe or Eurasia, that can quickly deploy a deep taproot and utilize that soil water resource. Here's a climate diagram showing temperature and precipitation. Here you can see the parts of the year in the winter January, February, March, November, December. These are areas where you normally get recharge. In our experiment, we cut sagebrush and expected to see the weeds to increase. We also cut sagebrush and we blocked just that precipitation which occurs during the wintertime and would normally recharge the deep soil water. And if our ideas were correct, then we expected to see the weeds, such as the tragopogon, goat's beard, increase following the loss of sagebrush. But if we remove the sagebrush and block that increase in deep soil water that you normally get in the absence of sagebrush, the weeds would not be present. And more or less, that's what we observed. Incidentally, these are two species, goat's beard and prickly lettuce, which are prevalent I think for most of the Great Basin, at least that I've seen. They're commonly not on the noxious species list, and I've never, as an example of the lack of transparency or conflicting perspectives in our herb communities, I've never really seen a good rationale for this other than sage grouse and other animals actually eat these guys. I think that there's risks associated with the presence of these species to the stability and diversity of the native community. Anyways, we conducted population transition matrices. You can see here, in the control condition, we have lots of shrubs. These species can either not or can only barely form a population, a sustainable population. If you remove the shrubs, you get a huge population increase. I wish we removed grasses, but we didn't. I can tell you if you graze areas, usually the loss of grasses is not followed with a tremendous increase in these species around the shrubs. So this is definitely unique to sagebrush. In the case of goat's beard, the shelter was able to remove the effect, showing that the increase in goat's beard is indeed linked to the deep soil water, so you can understand mechanism. Not that, sagebrush alone is the driver of the prickly lettuce invasion here. This is people from the BLM who are concerned with doing sagebrush removals or reductions for fuels have argued that these treatments are only short-term in nature, but we have very similar plots, 13 years old, and there's only more of these species in those. And those plots are located about 100 yards from this experiment. The most surprising result, to me, based on the literature, was that, not that we saw an increase in weeds, that was not terribly surprising to me. What was terribly surprising was that we saw a distinctive and consistent reduction in the abundance of native forbs upon the removal of sagebrush. And that does not compare very well with the literature, but this is a well-replicated, robust experiment, N equals 6, large plots, dutifully performed. We were careful not to trample and everything like that, so the results are reliable. Anyways, so we're finding that loss of sagebrush increases the exotics, surprisingly causes native forbs to decrease. These definitely are probably not the desired outcomes of our treatments to fuels and things like that. And I know that these results may or may not compare well with similar experiments going on elsewhere in the Great Basin. And so the cross comparisons of studies will be important to do in the future. But the main thing here is that grass-dominated communities might not be as stable as we think, particularly when they're under pressure from exotic propagules. And here's a graph that I just threw in here for Gene Chambers. We talked about this in the hall, and I just threw this in about 5 minutes ago. Well, I have 5 minutes left to talk. With time-sense disturbance. Disturbance tends to select against woody plants in the Great Basin and in lots of other cool temperate habitats. Meanwhile, herbs dominate the sites. With time since disturbance, woody plants reestablish, okay? And as the community fills in with these different functional groups, shallow and deep-rooted, for example, resource availability, like the availability of water, should be under more control of the native or resident plants, and less of those resources should be available to exotics, like spotted knapweed or thistles, for example. And the decreased invasibility should confer an increased stability. Consider that in the absence of fire, a very dense population of juniper or sagebrush is, although it might be undesirable for rangeland values, it's pretty darn stable. Where do we want to be on this diagram? That's an important question. I've never heard anybody describe how land management aims to be in some place in this scheme, and I think that might be a useful exercise. Now let's hear a little bit about what we can do to bolster native plants. This comes from Beth, my co-author's study. Rapid evolution is very well known from plants that become tolerant of heavy metals in soils, that plants that develop herbicide resistance around farm fields, and native plants that change their genotypic constitution upon having new neighbors. And she has a great idea, I think, in that in most cheatgrass infestations, you can usually find a few, albeit scraggly, native plants. The question is, what do these native plants, these survivors of cheatgrass, have to offer us? Can we utilize them to improve restoration? Have they developed an increased ability to endure cheatgrass, and can we propagate their genes in our restoration material? Here's some evidence for the effect. They collected plants, native grasses from invaded and cheatgrass-free sites. They split the plants up. They're bunch grasses, so they put half into pots by themselves, and then the other half would go into a pot with cheatgrass. Here's the perennial grasses they used, so Steppe comata, poa, etc. This graph shows the major results. It tells us that in 3 out of the 5 sites that they looked at, indeed the native plants that had endured cheatgrass infestation had a better competitive ability to grow with cheatgrass. And on top of this, she has identified the traits, the growth traits that seem to confer a greater resistance to cheatgrass. And I think that's pretty exciting. So here what you're seeing here is the growth of plants with and without the cheatgrass, and plants, again, were either from the cheatgrass invaded or the cheatgrass free land. And here what you can see is a greater value means that you've had a stronger reduction in growth when you were grown with cheatgrass. And you can see that plants from the uninvaded land did better. She compared the following traits with the plants that were from the cheatgrass infestations, from plants that were naturally in areas that naturally didn't have cheatgrass. And basically it looks to me like the plants that endure cheatgrass express traits, weedy invasive traits, like cheatgrass. They green up quicker, they germinate more readily, they grow their roots a little quicker, they're a little bit smaller, and sometimes they do more for reproduction. This has important implications. Number one, cheatgrass is changing the genetic constitution of our native landscapes. They seem to be making it more weedy, not in their own presence, in addition to their own presence, but also by causing the natives to actually act a little bit weedier in their tendencies. But more importantly, Beth's main point is that we can perhaps take the seeds from these guys and select them and increase them for restoration, and we can begin to think about how their traits might confer an advantage. Okay, I'm pretty much out of time. I have one final point. Looking down the road, so we have very conflicting opinions towards sagebrush. It's a weed. No, we need it for sagegrass. We need to reduce it for fuels. We need to keep it for preserving native herb diversity. Here's sagebrush along the side of the road. By the way, how many people are here from the DOT, Department of Transportation? Transportation. Did I tell you I'm an ecophysiologist? Department of Transportation. Okay, I would argue to you that you can never restore the West without having people from the Department of Transportation of the states and the feds and the water managers and the water companies that oversee the irrigation ditches. Those are the main vectors. Those are our opportunities. Looking down the road, that's where we need to be looking. And I hope at your next meeting, your next symposium, you'll have somebody from the DOT or a canal company come in and speak to you. Where are we going? We've recently got a grant funded to form a research, education, and extension network of a great many people to deal with current and future invasions of brome species, not just Bromus tectorum, but also red brome from the warm deserts, smooth brome from the higher elevations. It's a modest grant, but we are fortunate to have the support of the Great Basin Research and Management Partnership, highly effective group. This proposal was an outcome of the interactions of the GBRMP. We'll have 3 meetings, including one at the Ecological Society of America. Look for the website with a database on bromes, chat rooms. We'll have some proceedings, but the most important thing that we're going to produce, this group, in my opinion, is proposals for future research. We've got economists on board, social scientists, people interested in biocontrol, geneticists, wide range of people, well represented from this university. And so we're going to look to the future, down the road, to bring together the people for the kind of effective collaboration needed for dealing with this woeful problem of herbaceous community change in the West. Thanks.
Has any of your other work included hydrologic changes associated with sagebrush removal?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so has any of our work indicated eco-hydrological changes associated with the vegetation shifts? Almost every example that I showed to you up there is deeply connected to eco-hydrological processes of infiltration, rooting depth, water storage, deep infiltration to base flow. I saw Ron Rael give a talk once that talked about deep infiltration in an old lake bottom where the groundwater was salty. Am I getting that right? Okay, that's a well-known problem and hallmark of desertification in Australia. Yeah, so the answer is there are very explicit linkages of eco-hydrological processes. And one of the most exciting aspects of those linkages are that, first of all, I think we understand them pretty well. We've been able to study them by using isotope tracers and things like that in water budgets. But because our system has such I would argue, a clean hydroclimatological pattern where we're winter wet. I think Bob Nowak talked about this morning. We're winter wet or spring wet, we have deep recharge, and then we're summer dry. So we have water that gets stored and then water that may or may not come in the summertime to wet the surfaces. And the really important thing here is that this is cold desert for the most part. And low temperatures regulate the plant use of water, and that feeds into the ability of water to either infiltrate and be stored in deep soil horizons or not. And the most exciting thing about all this to me is that I think that we could have a high predictive capability to show how different climate scenarios, different warming scenarios, would bear out to affect the soil water patterns and the vulnerability of these landscapes to exotic plant invasions. And one of my greatest hopes is that I referred to Bethany Bradley's studies. Okay, she's projected out the future invasion of cheatgrass based on things like annual temperature, mean spring temperature, annual precipitation. Well, I think people like your group and my group would be pretty quick to say that annual measures of climate will do little for helping you predict the spread of exotic herbs. In fact, that there's very unique spatial and temporal patterns of water availability that, for instance, warm summer temperatures that coincide with an abundant supply of deep soil water for sagebrush. You know, I mean, that's a recipe for sagebrush. Cheatgrass, the recipe there is some, moderately cool temperatures that help keep the moisture near the surface of the soil. It's that sort of window of hydroclimatological opportunity that I think drives these herbaceous communities. And I think we, it'll take some work, but I think that that making concise and reliable predictions for exotic plants based on hydroclimatology is within our reach, and it would be very useful.